It was just another spring morning in Danville, Illinois, the kind where memories float like dust motes in golden sunlight streaming through old windows. Sarah Hackman hadn't walked these hallways in almost 30 years. The familiar scent of floor polish and chalk transported her instantly back to her teenage years, long before her father's fame had become a part of her identity rather than the whole of it. She ran her fingers along the metal lockers, pausing at what she thought might have been hers, though she couldn't be certain anymore. Danville High hadn't changed much. Perhaps that was the charm of small-town America, its stubborn resistance to time. Sarah had come back for the alumni fundraiser, a last-minute decision after receiving the invitation. Being the daughter of Hollywood legend Gene Hackman had taught her to keep a low profile, to cherish anonymity. Yet something had pulled her back this time. "Can I help you, ma'am?" The voice startled her, friendly but cautious. Sarah turned around, her practiced smile at the ready, the one that deflected questions about her father, when she froze. Those eyes, she knew those eyes. Older now, set in a face weathered by decades, but unmistakable. "Mr. Jenkins," she whispered. The elderly man squinted, leaning slightly on his mop. "Do I know you, miss?" Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. "It's Sarah. Sarah Hackman, class of '92. Recognition dawned slowly on his face, like sunrise over the Illinois cornfields. "Little Sarah? Gene's daughter? My goodness, look at you." Mr. Jenkins, Carl, as the staff had called him, had been the head janitor at Danville High for as long as anyone could remember. But that had been decades ago. He had to be at least 80 now, his once broad shoulders slightly stooped, his hands gnarled from years of manual labor. "You're still working here?" Sarah couldn't hide her surprise. "I thought you would have retired long ago." A smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. "What would I do with myself? Sit at home watching reruns of your daddy's movies?" He chuckled, his laugh familiar and warm. "Besides, these kids still need someone to look after them." Sarah remembered how Mr. Jenkins had always been more than a janitor. He was the unofficial counselor for troubled teens, the grandfather figure who never judged, the man who somehow always appeared when a student was having a breakdown in the hallway. He'd been there for her too, during those difficult years when her parents' divorce and her father's fame had made her both a target and an outcast. "You probably don't remember, but you were kind to me when I needed it most," Sarah said softly. "I remember every one of my kids," he replied, his voice gentle but firm. "Including the day you stood up to those girls who were bullying the new student. You've got your father's strength, but a heart all your own." Sarah felt her eyes moisten. She hadn't thought about that day in years, how she'd finally found her voice, standing up for someone else when she couldn't stand up for herself. "Come on," Mr. Jenkins said, propping his mop against the wall. "Principal's letting me use the old storage room as an office these days. I've got coffee that tastes like motor oil and some store-bought cookies that'll probably break your teeth, but the company's decent." The office was little more than a converted janitor's closet, with a small desk wedged between shelves of cleaning supplies. Photos covered one wall, generations of Danville High students, some yellowed with age. Sarah spotted her class photo, and to her surprise, a candid shot of herself at graduation. "You keep photos of all the students?" "Just the special ones," he said, pouring coffee into a mug that proclaimed, "World's Best Grandpa." "The ones who might need reminding someday that they mattered to someone." Sarah sank into the folding chair, suddenly overwhelmed. Here was a man who had cleaned floors and fixed leaky faucets for over 50 years, who could have retired decades ago to a life of comfort, still showing up every day. Not for the paycheck, which she suspected was meager, but for the purpose. "Why?" she asked simply. Mr. Jenkins didn't pretend to misunderstand. "When your wife passes after 42 years of marriage, and your only son moves to Seattle with the grandkids, well, you need somewhere to belong." He sipped his coffee, grimacing at the taste. "These halls, these kids, they give me reason to set my alarm each morning." Sarah thought about her own life in Los Angeles, successful by any measure, running a production company, married to a wonderful man, mother to 2 teenagers who barely looked up from their phones. She had everything, and yet sometimes felt she had nothing at all. No roots, no community, no place where she truly belonged outside of her family name. I saw your father's last film before he retired, Mr. Jenkins said, changing the subject. The one where he played that retired teacher. Reminded me of myself a bit. Sarah nodded, remembering how her father had called her after reading that script, more excited than he'd been in years. Gene Hackman had found dignity in that character, a man whose quiet influence had rippled through generations. Dad always said the best roles were the ones that showed the extraordinary in ordinary lives, Sarah replied. Smart man, your father. They talked for almost an hour, Mr. Jenkins sharing stories of the school's changes over the decades, of students who had returned as teachers, of the community that had raised generations of children together. Sarah found herself sharing, too, about her own children, her work, the strange emptiness that sometimes visited her despite her full life. When the bell rang, signaling the change of classes, Mr. Jenkins sighed and reached for his mop. Duty calls. These teenagers are still as messy as they were in your day. Sarah stood, suddenly reluctant to leave. It was wonderful seeing you again, Mr. Jenkins. Carl, he corrected with a smile. I think you're old enough now to call me Carl. As she watched him shuffle down the hallway, nodding and greeting students by name, Sarah felt something shift inside her. She had come to Danville out of obligation, perhaps even out of curiosity. She hadn't expected to find inspiration in the form of an 80-year-old janitor who had cleaned the same floors for over half a century. Before leaving the school, Sarah made a detour to the principal's office. What had started as a simple question about Carl Jenkins' retirement plans became a longer conversation about the school's budget challenges, the lack of proper retirement benefits for support staff, and the quiet dignity of a man who kept working because the alternative was a lonely existence on an insufficient pension. As Sarah drove away from Danville High, her mind was already racing with ideas. Her father had taught her that real power wasn't in being recognized, it was in recognizing others. And somehow, she knew that this unexpected reunion was about to change more lives than just her own. She pulled over and made a call to her assistant in Los Angeles. Cancel my meetings for the next week, she said decisively, and get me everything you can find about school district retirement benefits in Illinois. We're going to be here longer than I thought. The plan forming in her mind wasn't fully clear yet, but one thing was certain. Carl Jenkins had spent a lifetime seeing students who felt invisible. It was time someone saw him. Sarah sat in her rental car outside the modest bungalow on Elm Street, gathering her courage. According to the school secretary, this had been Carl Jenkins' home for the past 53 years. The small front yard was impeccably maintained with neatly trimmed hedges and a bird feeder hanging from the single maple tree. It was exactly what she would have expected from a man who took such pride in his work. The door opened before she could knock, and Carl appeared, wearing faded jeans and a plaid shirt instead of his customary gray uniform. The secretary called to warn me, he explained with a smile. Said Gene Hackman's daughter was asking questions about me. Should I be worried? Sarah laughed. I hope not. I was wondering if I could talk to you about something important. His living room was like stepping into another era. Family photos in wooden frames, a recliner that had seen better days, and a television that probably predated flat screens. A single gold frame held the photo of a woman with kind eyes and Carl's smile. Martha, he said, noticing Sarah's gaze. My wife. Been gone 12 years now. She was beautiful. She was patient, he corrected with a soft chuckle. Had to be. Married to me. Now, what's so important that brings Hollywood to my doorstep twice in 1 week? Sarah took a deep breath. I've been making some calls, Mr. Jenkins. Carl, did you know that with your years of service, you should have qualified for full retirement benefits almost 15 years ago? The old man's expression didn't change. I'm aware, but you kept working because the pension wouldn't cover my mortgage and Martha's medical bills. His voice was matter-of-fact, without a trace of bitterness. And now, well, I keep working because the school needs me. Budget cuts hit the maintenance staff first. They're down to me and 2 part-timers for the whole building. Sarah felt a flash of anger at the system that had failed this man, but she pressed on. What if I told you I want to establish a fund, not just for you, but for all the support staff at Danville High? A proper retirement package, health benefits, the works. Carl studied her for a long moment. That's very generous, but I don't need charity, Sarah. It's not charity, she insisted. It's recognition. It's what should have been provided all along. And I'd like to start with a proper retirement celebration for you. His laugh was sudden and genuine. I'm not retiring. Not even if we found a way to replace you with 2 full-time staff members who need the jobs? Not even if you could still visit, maybe mentor students occasionally, but without having to mop floors at 80? A shadow crossed his face. What would I do all day? This was the question Sarah had been dreading, the real reason she suspected he kept working long past when others would have quit. That's actually my second proposal. The school has no formal mentorship program, no way to connect students with adults who can guide them. What if we created one, with you as its first director? For the first time, Carl looked truly surprised. Me? I'm just a janitor. No, Sarah said firmly. You were never just a janitor. You were the person who saw every student, not just the star athletes or straight-A scholars. You noticed the ones sitting alone, the ones struggling, the ones like me who were trying desperately to blend into the wallpaper. Carl looked down at his weathered hands. I just tried to be kind. And that's exactly what makes you perfect for this. The Carl Jenkins Mentorship Program, connecting students with retirees, community members, people with wisdom to share. The old man was quiet for so long that Sarah worried she had offended him. When he finally looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Your father called me once. Did you know that? He said unexpectedly. Sarah blinked in surprise. Dad called you? Carl nodded. After your graduation, said he wanted to thank me for looking out for his little girl during some tough years. Said he'd been so busy building his career that he'd missed seeing some important moments, but he was grateful someone else had been there. He paused. It meant a lot coming from Gene Hackman, but it would have meant just as much coming from any parent. Sarah felt her own eyes fill with tears. Her father had never mentioned the call. He sent me tickets to every one of his movies after that, Carl continued. I've seen them all, even the ones the critics didn't like much. He smiled faintly. Your dad plays a good tough guy, but you know what I always saw? The heart underneath, just like his daughter. Sarah wiped her eyes. Is that a yes to my proposal? It's a let me think about it, Carl replied. But I appreciate you seeing me, Sarah. Really seeing me. As she drove back to her hotel, Sarah made another call, this time to her father. It had been weeks since they'd spoken properly. Quick texts about family matters, brief updates about her kids, his grandchildren. Their relationship had improved tremendously over the years, but there were still walls neither knew how to breach completely. Dad, I need your help with something important. She explained about Carl, about the retirement fund, about the mentorship program. She expected questions, maybe even hesitation. Her father had grown more careful about public appearances in his retirement years. Instead, his response was immediate. Give me his address. I'll be there tomorrow. You're coming to Danville? Sarah couldn't hide her shock. But you hate public appearances now. This isn't about publicity, Gene Hackman replied, his voice gruff with emotion. This is about honoring a good man. Besides, I think it's time I thanked him in person, don't you? As Sarah hung up, she felt the first glimmer of something wonderful taking shape. This wasn't just about helping Carl Jenkins anymore. It was about connections across time, about recognition that came decades late but was no less meaningful, about the quiet heroes who shaped lives without fanfare or acclaim. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was also about healing old wounds in her own family. The black SUV pulled up to Danville High School without fanfare, but heads still turned. In a town this size, strangers were noticed. When Gene Hackman stepped out, tall and imposing despite his years, whispers instantly rippled through the parking lot. He adjusted his baseball cap low over his eyes, a futile attempt at anonymity for one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces. Sarah met him at the entrance, suddenly feeling like a teenager again. Her father had always had that effect, his presence filling any room he entered. Age had softened some of his edges, but at 95, Gene Hackman still commanded attention without trying. You didn't have to come yourself, Sarah said, hugging him. I could have handled this. Some things a man needs to do in person, he replied, his voice that familiar gravelly rumble that had delivered countless memorable lines. Where is he? They found Carl in the cafeteria, supervising the afternoon cleanup. He was showing a young helper how to properly wring a mop, the same lesson Sarah had seen him demonstrate to generations of student workers and new janitors. When he looked up and saw Gene Hackman walking toward him, Carl's mop clattered to the floor. Mr. Hackman, he managed, his weathered face registering shock. Mr. Jenkins, Gene nodded, extending his hand. I believe we've spoken on the phone, but never properly met. Carl's hand, calloused and strong despite his age, gripped Gene's firmly. Once, years ago, never thought I'd have the honor in person. The two men regarded each other with mutual respect, both in their winter years, both having led vastly different lives that had somehow intersected through Sarah. The cafeteria had gone completely silent, students and staff alike frozen in disbelief at the sight of the Hollywood legend standing in their midst. I understand you've been looking after this place for over 50 years, Gene said. Just doing my job, sir. And looking after my daughter when she needed it most. The actor's eyes softened. For that, I've owed you a proper thank you for decades. Principal Davis appeared, flustered and trying to maintain composure. Mr. Hackman, what an unexpected honor. If we'd known you were coming... This isn't an official visit, Gene cut in smoothly. Just a private matter between Mr. Jenkins and myself. He turned back to Carl. I wonder if you might show me around. I've heard so much about this school from Sarah, but never seen it through the eyes of someone who knows its every corner. For the next hour, the unlikely pair walked the halls of Danville High, the octogenarian janitor and the nonagenarian actor, deep in conversation that no one else could hear. They paused at the trophy case, where Carl pointed out teams from different eras, at classroom doors where he shared anecdotes about remarkable teachers, at quiet corners where he'd once counseled troubled students. Sarah followed at a distance, giving them space while fielding endless questions from starstruck faculty and students. She watched her father listening intently to Carl's stories, nodding, occasionally laughing, genuinely engaged in a way she rarely saw him with strangers anymore. By the time they returned to the main office, word had spread throughout Danville. Former students were already appearing, drawn by social media posts and text chains, announcing Gene Hackman's presence at their old high school. Your plan is gathering momentum, Gene said quietly to Sarah, as they watched Carl greeting former students who had come specifically to see him. What's next? We announced the Carl Jenkins Legacy Fund at tomorrow's alumni event, Sarah replied. I've already secured commitments from several of your industry friends. We should have enough to establish both the retirement package and the mentorship program. Gene nodded thoughtfully. Add my name to that list. Whatever you've raised, I'll match it. Dad, you don't have to. I want to, he interrupted gently. Some things matter more than money, Sarah. Some debts can't be repaid except by paying forward. That evening, they dined at Danville's only upscale restaurant, a table for three, set in a private corner. Carl had protested the invitation, insisting he'd be out of place, but Gene had been adamant. Two old-timers swapping stories, he'd said. Nothing fancy about that. Over steaks and bourbon, the conversation flowed easily between reminiscences of Sarah's high school days and discussions of more recent times. Carl spoke of his son in Seattle, of grandchildren he rarely saw, of the community that had become his family. Gene shared stories of his retirement years, of the films he was proudest of his regrets as a father during the height of his career. I missed too much, Gene admitted, glancing at Sarah. Chasing the next role, the next challenge. By the time I realized what mattered most, so many moments were already gone. But you were there for the important ones, Sarah said softly. My graduation, my wedding, the birth of your grandchildren. Thanks to good people who reminded me what mattered, Gene replied, raising his glass to Carl. To the unsung heroes who keep the world running while the rest of us get the applause. As they parted for the night, Carl shook Gene's hand again. Never thought I'd be having dinner with Popeye Doyle himself, he said with a grin. And I never thought I'd meet the man who helped shape my daughter into someone far better than me, Gene replied honestly. Tomorrow's going to change things for you, Carl. I hope you're ready. As they watched Carl's ancient pickup truck pull away, Sarah leaned against her father's arm. "Thank you for coming. It means everything to him, and to me." Gene put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "You know what I see when I look at you planning all this? I see your mother's heart and determination, the best parts of both of us." For Sarah, that simple observation healed something she hadn't realized was still broken. Tomorrow would be about Carl Jenkins and his legacy, but today had given her an unexpected gift, a bridge across years of complicated father-daughter history, built on the foundation of gratitude to a man who had quietly shaped more lives than anyone had realized, including perhaps their own. Danville High School's gymnasium had never looked so transformed. The bleachers were retracted, replaced by dozens of round tables draped in blue and gold, the school colors. Alumni from across 5 decades mingled beneath twinkling lights strung across the ceiling, the usual scent of sweat and rubber replaced by catered food and floral centerpieces. Sarah stood near the entrance, greeting former classmates who seemed more interested in glimpsing her famous father than reminiscing about shared adolescent experiences. Gene had chosen to arrive fashionably late, wanting tonight to be about Carl rather than himself, a gesture that only deepened Sarah's appreciation for how her father had grown over the years. Carl Jenkins arrived wearing a suit that looked as though it had been purchased during the Reagan administration, slightly too large for his frame now, but meticulously pressed. He seemed uncomfortable with the attention, smiling shyly as former students approached to share memories of his kindness over the decades. "He has no idea what's coming, does he?" Principal Davis murmured to Sarah. She shook her head. "Not the full extent." The evening proceeded with speeches from distinguished alumni, recognition of retired teachers, and the standard fundraising appeals. Throughout it all, Carl sat at a table near the back, occasionally checking his watch, no doubt thinking of the floors that would need buffing before Monday classes. Finally, the principal took the stage again. "We have a special presentation tonight, one that wasn't on your printed programs. I'd like to invite Sarah Hackman to the podium." A ripple of interest moved through the crowd as Sarah walked to the microphone. She spotted her father slipping in through a side door, taking a seat at an empty table without fanfare. "Many of you know me as Gene Hackman's daughter," she began, "and for years, that was primarily how I defined myself too. But during my time at Danville High, I learned that we are all so much more than our connections or our circumstances." She paused, finding Carl's eyes in the crowd. "Tonight, I want to talk about someone who taught me that lesson without ever saying a word about it. Someone who has given 53 years of service to this school, not for recognition or advancement, but out of genuine dedication to generations of students who passed through these halls." The room had gone completely silent. Carl Jenkins joined the maintenance staff at Danville High in 1971. Since then, he has cleaned up our messes, fixed what we broke, and most importantly, seen us, really seen us, when we felt invisible. On the screen behind her, photos began to appear, yearbook images of a younger Carl, candid shots of him helping students through the decades, images contributed by alumni when word of tonight's tribute had spread. I've spent the past week talking to former students, teachers, and administrators. The stories they shared weren't about how well Carl mopped floors or fixed leaky pipes, though he did those things exceptionally well. Sarah smiled. They were about the times he appeared with a kind word when someone was crying in the hallway, about how he remembered every student's name, even years after graduation, about how he quietly paid for prom tickets for students who couldn't afford them, thinking no one noticed. Carl stared at his hands, clearly uncomfortable with the spotlight but unable to escape it. Mr. Jenkins never expected recognition. In fact, when I approached him about tonight, he tried to decline. But some people deserve to be celebrated, especially when they don't seek the applause. Sarah gestured to the back of the room where the school's maintenance staff stood together. Tonight, I'm honored to announce the establishment of the Carl Jenkins Legacy Fund, which will ensure that support staff at Danville High receive the retirement benefits and recognition they deserve. As of this morning, this fund has reached $1 million in commitments from alumni and friends of the school. Gasps and applause rippled through the gymnasium. Carl's head snapped up, his expression one of disbelief. Additionally, Sarah continued once the noise had subsided, the Carl Jenkins Mentorship Program will pair students with community members who can provide guidance, support, and the kind of quiet wisdom that Mr. Jenkins has offered freely for over 5 decades. And I'm pleased to announce that our first donor has agreed to fund a dedicated space within the school for this program, the Carl Jenkins Center for Student Support. She extended her hand toward her father, who rose and walked to the podium amid thunderous applause. Gene Hackman's presence electrified the room, but his words were directed solely at Carl. "Mr. Jenkins," he said, his famous voice carrying easily without the microphone, "please join us." Slowly, almost reluctantly, Carl made his way to the stage. Standing between father and daughter, he looked smaller than his years of service suggested, humbled by the outpouring of appreciation. "I'm just a janitor," he said, when Sarah offered him the microphone. "No, sir," Gene Hackman replied, his voice firm. "You're the man who saw my daughter when I was too busy to see her clearly. You're the man who has shaped lives without seeking credit. You're exactly the kind of hero this world needs more of." The elderly janitor looked out at the sea of faces, former students now grown, colleagues past and present, community members who had heard about tonight's event through Danville's efficient grapevine. For the first time, he saw the impact of his decades of quiet service reflected back at him. "I never did anything special," Carl said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Just tried to be kind. Just tried to make sure no one felt invisible." "That," Sarah said gently, "is the most special thing of all." As the crowd rose in a standing ovation, Sarah watched tears stream down Carl's weathered cheeks. This wasn't just about money or programs or buildings named in his honor. It was about a life of selfless service, finally being acknowledged, about the ripple effect of small kindnesses multiplied across generations. In the front row, a group of current students, members of the school newspaper, captured everything on their phones. By morning, Carl Jenkins would be trending on social media, his story spreading far beyond Danville. But that wasn't what mattered most to Sarah. What mattered was the moment when her father embraced the man who had mopped floors for 53 years, 2 elders from vastly different worlds, united by mutual respect and the recognition that true legacy isn't measured in fame or fortune, but in lives touched and hearts changed. And in that moment, watching these 2 men who had shaped her in such different ways, Sarah Hackman finally understood what her father had spent a lifetime portraying on screen. The extraordinary dignity of ordinary heroes, seen at last in the fullness of their quiet glory.